Now every deck is definitely a little bit different. Some are bigger, some are smaller, they're made out of different materials, but this is a pretty simple deck demolition project that I think will give you a sense of just some of the things to look for, and I'm going to go through some tips and tricks that you should think about, consider, maybe incorporate into your own deck demolition project. First off, if you plan to preserve and reuse any of the wood in your deck, you might want to try unscrewing every screw like I did here, or pulling out every nail. Now it's time consuming and it's going to drive you a little bit nuts, but it is the way to get the wood out with the least amount of damage. Alright, second tip is you need a Sawzall, sometimes called a reciprocating saw. It's a beast of a tool and it's just like a demo specialist. Any demolition project really needs a Sawzall, especially cutting a deck out. If you avoid cutting the fasteners, you know, the screws and the nails and the brackets, your blade's going to last longer, but you're probably going to hit some of that stuff. Alright, my next tip is that some portions of your deck framing can come out in chunks if you want to. So you just don't need to cut every single piece of wood and remove it almost like it went in. You can take out chunks of this deck at a time and put them in your truck or dumpster or whatever you're going to do with them. Alright, let's talk a little bit about leverage. You're going to want to use a lot of leverage as you demo this deck. It's going to be easier and more effective, and you're going to bust your own back and your arms and everything a lot less. You might have noticed that I started out using a small pry bar. Don't do that. A small pry bar is just going to waste your time. For most of the project, I use a 6-foot long rock bar. It's kind of like a landscaping tool, and it's really effective to have a big pry bar. You can buy a dedicated deck wrecker, I think they're called, and I'll put a link down below if you want to. Or you can use a Burke bar. If you get a strong enough Burke bar, it will allow you to rip out deck boards. But I just used my big old heavy rock bar and it got the job done. Even on this rotted old deck where things were falling apart, many of the boards were screwed down really solid, and you're not going to get them out without some leverage. Alright, next tip. Figure out what you're doing with all your old deck wood beforehand. Don't just start ripping your deck apart without a plan for where that stuff's going to go. On this job, I had to park my truck kind of down this driveway. And it was a short walk once, but the second time it felt a little bit longer, and the third time even longer. You really don't want that. If you can, get your dumpster or your truck or whatever you're hauling stuff away with, get it right up next to your deck. It's just going to be way easier and more effective in the long run. Alright, so in demoing a deck, first goes the decking, then goes the framing. That's the way I do it. You might want to do sections like that. Like in a section, take out the decking, then the framing. But I would not recommend doing decking and framing at the same time. They're kind of just different jobs and different structure. Framing is almost always pressure treated wood, and I think you're going to find that it's in better shape than the decking. It just lasts longer. I pulled some of the framing out whole, but I also cut the tips off of a lot of the framing members and then ripped them out individually. Now, a lot of people in demoing decks like to take a circular saw and cut lines, or kind of like strips, through the decking before ripping it out. And in fact, the people who own this house did this a while back. They went ahead and cut some lines in the deck as they were going to start the demo job themselves. And you'll see that there's this line through the decking, and when I rip out the boards, they kind of come out at the line. Now, if you've got a circular saw, you might want to give this a try and see how you like it. Personally, I kind of like pulling out full-length deck boards, as if they're not rotten, I can reuse them, and longer boards are always better to reuse and recycle. The other thing I like about that is that if you got a long deck board, you're pulling out 12 feet of wood at a time instead of 2 6-foot pieces, which is just a little bit more time consuming. But that's just me. If you want to cut up your deck with a circular saw, go for it. Now, with all this fast forward action in my video, I'm kind of worried that I'm going to give you the impression that this is a fast project, but it's not. Deck demo is slow and methodical, and if you don't move slowly and methodically, you're probably going to hurt yourself. If you're using like a massive pry bar of some kind, that thing's going to get heavier and heavier throughout the day. So going slow is good. Taking breaks is recommended. Switching off jobs is also a really good idea. You won't get hurt as much It's not that you won't get hurt. You just won't get hurt as much if you take it easy in demoing a deck. You also don't want to get sloppy. You don't want to like break windows in the house when you're swinging a bar or a shovel or whatever. You want your deck to go out cleanly and nicely, so take it slow. This little video chunk right here is what it was like in actual real time to wreck this deck. Easy does it. So where do you want to start? My method here was to start at the farthest point away from my truck, and actually a gate and a fence, and then work back toward that gate and the truck. And this is because the deck was a lot better to walk on than the ground, and I wanted to be hauling stuff across the deck, not across uneven ground. But your plan is going to depend on your space, your deck, and a bunch of other things. So just figure it out, make a plan, and then work in that direction. Like I said before, if you start tearing out your deck on two different sides at once, you might end up kind of stuck in the middle with nowhere to go. Another point about leverage. Now, as you pull your deck apart, you don't necessarily need to cut every single piece of wood on both ends. Here, I'm just cutting one end of all these joists, and then I'm using their length. They're like 4 or 5 feet long. I'm using their length as leverage to rip them out of their joist hangers. And you can do this with long decking boards as well. You kind of loosen half of the board, or a third of the board, or 2/3 of the board, just not the whole thing, and then use the length of that board as leverage to rip the rest out. It's going to be a time saver, and if you're reusing your wood, it's going to yield longer pieces that are uncut in the end. All right, let's talk a little bit about surprises that come with a deck demo. Here's one. The deck on this side has actually fused and connected to the fence. And that made the fence more solid when they put the fence in, but it means pulling out the deck is a little bit complicated. So removing the deck meant detaching it from the fence. And many decks, I would say most decks, are connected to something, even if that's just the house. And decks are connected to a house via a ledger board, which is bolted to the frame of the house structure in some way. This means that you don't want to like thrash your decking near the house and just be ripping at it, because you might tear off the siding of your house, which you probably don't want to do. So instead, unscrew and carefully disassemble those boards and ledger boards near the house, and you're going to do less or no damage. A few more fun surprises. This deck also had an electrical system underneath it, and you can see those electrical wires are in that gray conduit running underneath the deck, and even connected to the deck in some places. Now, if you wham jam with your skill saw and just start cutting at your deck, you're probably going to cut through some wires and lines and whatever else is hidden underneath your deck. So go slow, look before you cut, turn off circuit breakers, look twice before you cut. It's just going to benefit you in the long run. All right, another fun surprise here with this deck demo project is that there was a groundhog den underneath the deck, and these guys didn't know about it. It actually caved in at some point, so there's just kind of like a big crater under the deck. And I point this out just to say that I would not expect, when you demo your deck, for there to be like perfect level ground underneath that you can just throw some grass seed on. Decks are things that animals go underneath of to eat stuff, make it through the winter, and sometimes die. So decks can be kind of nasty underneath. They collect trash and weeds and whatnot. So expect to need to do some cleanup after that deck is out of place. Okay, so time to pull out the ledger boards, and I'm just going to say a few things about that. Again, the ledger board is that piece of pressure treated wood, usually like a 2x6, a 2x8, 2x10. It's bolted to the house, and they're almost always bolted to the house with big old lag bolts. And you can unscrew the bolts with a socket set, or you can use a socket and an impact driver, which is what I did. And in this case, the lag bolts were pretty rusted out. Some of them just fell out, some of them broke, and then others were like the day they were put in, like stuck in place and really strong. So it took some elbow grease to remove some of them, and others just came out. I think you'll find the same thing. But remove the bolts, and the ledgers should just come right off the house. They might be glued to the house with some construction adhesive, so they might take a little bit of prying, but that's pretty uncommon. And if there's flashing over the ledgers or under the ledgers, you probably want to pull that off too. One more thing is that if you can't find a ledger bolt, like that ledger's just not coming off and you can't see the bolt, it's probably hiding underneath a joist hanger. That happens quite a bit when you assemble these things. You put the ledger bolts in, and then sometimes you have to put the joist hangers over the bolts. So knock out the joist hanger and you will reveal the missing bolt. Okay, so now you've got your posts to remove. This can be kind of tough. Posts are either sunk in the ground in concrete, or they're sitting on top of concrete, or they are just straight in the ground, or there's some combination of concrete and earth and all kinds of things. So it really varies. Sometimes you can bang on a post to loosen it, like I'm doing here, and then jack it out or pry it out and just pull it out of the ground. These babies weren't budging. I think they were sunk in a concrete footer down below, 2 or 3 feet down. So I dug down a few inches and then cut them off below ground level and then filled in the holes. You may just have to unbracket your posts and you're done. Or you may be the unlucky person who needs to actually dig out a giant concrete pier, in which case I'm sorry to hear about that, but it's going to be worth it in the end. All right, last tip I'm going to give you might be obvious like a few of the other ones. And that's just to have a plan for disposing of your materials. You can see I've got a truck full of deck wood in the back of my pickup. That's the second load I've taken out of this project, so it is a lot of material, and if you have a big deck, it'll build up. So plan for disposal fees, plan for a rollaway dumpster if you need to, or a trailer or a truck or whatever, but just think ahead. You're not gonna be able to just vanish all that wood from a big old deck, believe me. All right, thanks for checking out the video. I hope these tips and tricks are helpful if you're planning to tear apart your first deck. Just dig into it. It's not that hard of a job and not impossible by any means. You do need a few tools to make it easier for you, and you gotta bring your back to this job. It is hard manual labor, so don't work too fast and hurt yourself on the first day. Take it easy so you can get the job done and move on to the next one. All right, thanks for checking it out. I'll see you in the next project.